Okay, welcome to the rest of the story behind the sermon. I have said many times during COVID that the classes that were done where I recorded it in my closet at home were less than satisfying because we couldn't have any kind of feedback. And so even though you're not in the room, hopefully some of you have been able to log into your Google account and can chat with us and ask some questions. I want to thank Paul Catelli and Matt Thompson for running this show. Hopefully everything will work. I'm sure we'll hear from you if it doesn't. The rest of the story behind the sermon is an idea that I've had for some time because of the longing for more conversation than we typically get on any kind of a Sunday. And I'll put up here a slide. One of the things that I like to do when the scripture is read that's going to be preached from is to end that with, listen to what God might be saying to you, which is a way of recognizing that we're not all going to hear the same thing. And then, of course, we have this practice that we've had for a couple years now of following the sermon with a time of silent meditation, which is another moment for people to process what is God saying to you. How are you processing what you heard? And then, of course, pre-COVID, we used to also interact in the narthex or the parlor, but it was so brief, which leads me to say that many of us crave deeper, more meaningful interaction, and I have to say, preachers too. Some people have asked, what's it like preaching these days with the camera? Well, it's not the camera that's an issue, it's that there are no people. And you may, some of you that watch stand-up comedians or the shows on at 10:30, you know how much they're struggling because there's no energy coming back. And so for me, it's really more of, I don't get to see you. I don't get to read your body language. I don't get to see you squint or, nod your head or anything like that. So I've been craving more interaction. And hopefully we'll have some of that via the chat feature. So this is a weird title here, but Preaching and Eggs. Tom Long wrote a book called The Witness of Preaching. He's one of my very influential mentors, along with Fred Craddock and Gene Lowry and Barbara Brown Taylor. And in his book, The Witness of Preaching, he says that the old paradigm was that most of us understood that the preacher puts eggs in the people's baskets. So the preacher worked on the sermon and has it in this package, and I'm going to put it in your basket. And in that paradigm, the preacher is active, and the people are just passive receptacles. When I say that's the old paradigm, what I mean by that is that's the way we understood how communication works. It's not accurate, though. And so the new paradigm is a more accurate understanding of communication, and that is, and to quote Tom, preacher breaks the eggs, but people make their own omelets. And that is so true. I cannot tell you how many times at the door I have heard people say about a sermon in which I thought I said ABC, ABC, ABC. People at the door saying, oh, I so much appreciated that XYZ, that XYZ. And I'm thinking, where were you? What sermon were you listening to? But people are making their own omelets. And what that means then in our newer understanding of communication is that both of us have agency. I can, as a preacher, try to say whatever, but you're going to hear it and you're going to make sense of it your own way. That's not a bad thing at all. It's maybe a little frustrating for the preacher, and we can talk about that. So here's what I have in mind. I have two goals in mind. One is that we would reflect together on the sermon, in this case, one that was preached back in July. And notice that means that the eggs are kind of a mutual property. And also reflect together on the biblical text, because it's the church's scriptures, not the preacher's. This isn't my Bible. It's not Carla's Bible. It's not the clergy's Bible. The church has these scriptures that belong to us. And I couldn't help myself. I had to kind of tell on myself. Initially, when I put that slide together, I had learn about, which was just another indication of how easy it is for me to think, well, these are my eggs, and I want you to learn about something, instead of us together reflecting on sermon and biblical text. By the way, I didn't say this up front, but there's going to be some places throughout the presentation where you can make a chat and ask a question, and it'll be set. But feel free at any point, you can't raise your hand and I see you, but if you send a chat, any question, Matt's going to, on mic, you'll hear him, he'll say, Mike, we've got a question here. And it may be that I answer it right then, or I might say, hey, hang on to that, we'll get to it. But feel free to do that at any point. And we don't know exactly, this is a little bit of an experiment for us, we don't know exactly how long of a lag time we have between when you post and when we get it and so forth. So we'll all kind of learn and be patient. But feel free to send questions in, because honestly, this thing won't work if we don't have dialogue. Because even if we were in the room together, this presentation is built on the notion of, why don't we talk about what I talked about and you made an omelet out of a couple of months ago. So dialogical preaching, I've actually written quite a bit about this in articles and books, and there's 3 broad types, and this is not rocket science by any stretch. It's pretty obvious. You either are doing it before or during or after the sermon. So let me just say a little bit about those 3. Some of you may remember a class we did in which we actually put a sermon together. And that was, we would do 2 or 3 Monday nights, and I would read the text, talk about the text, and I would ask you, so what are you thinking about it? Here's what I'm thinking, and we would work on it together, and then eventually there'd be a Sunday when I preached it. And you would send in stories and emails, and we had dialogue about it and such along the way. So there is a kind of pre-sermon discussion. Some pastors do this with a small group that's kind of representative of the diversity of the body, and they'll meet on a Wednesday, and Carla's done that with Facebook. And the idea is that let's collaboratively sit around and listen and think. And the preacher's way of thinking about that is, yeah, I could read commentaries, I could read the Greek, I could read this or that, but what if I heard what people bring to this text? So that's that pre-sermon. There's also during the sermon, and notice I put there both metaphorically and literally. We don't tend to do the literal type, although I have seen it done, where during the sermon the preacher says, so what are you thinking about that? Or we'll even say, now talk to the person near you and talk about this. And honestly, I've seen people love that, and I've seen people who say, no, that does not fit who we are, and so forth. The metaphorical is more what we do. And here's what I mean. When I'm preaching, and I mentioned this a minute ago, I see you. I pay attention to you. And the you is plural, it's a y'all, but I am reading what's happening there. And most preachers are. And because we're a white church, predominantly white church, our during the sermon dialogue takes place. Matt, put the camera on me for a second, and I'll see if I can imitate it. This is, in the African American church, the person stands up maybe and says, hallelujah, Jesus, or that's right, preach it, tell it, you tell it. But in the white church, it's more like, And that would be the equivalent of an amen in the black church, right? Or a smile, a smirk, or just a kind of frown, a head turn. Those things matter, and that's a communication that's actually happening during a sermon. But the third one is the one that we're actually doing in this session and next week, and that is a post-sermon discussion. And again, that takes many forms. I've done it in a chapel at the seminary where I just asked one question at the end of the sermon and sat down, and then people started talking about it. But in this case, we're doing it, unfortunately, several weeks later and via a chat. But the idea is post-sermon discussion. So that requires a few clarifications. One is, I've always been curious about the expiration date on sermons. When I did my research for the book Craddock Stories, I went to Cherry Log, Georgia a couple of times. And I remember after Fred would preach, people would be at the Pink Pig eating lunch after church. And you'd hear them saying, well, what did you think about that story he told, about that cemetery in Charleston? That was just fascinating. And you could hear them talking about it. But my question is, how long? Do they talk about it at dinner on Sunday night as well? What about breakfast on Monday? Or has the sermon expired? How long does a sermon last? We can talk about that. Also, and clarification is, you might be surprised at how much material is left out of a sermon that could have made its way in. In fact, Gene Lowry, one of those other mentors I mentioned, said this is an important distinction between not so good preaching and good preaching, is that the desperate preacher is looking for one more board to nail on so that it looks like a doghouse. And he said, no, you should be working more like an artist who's carving or sculpting out of marble. You know, think Michelangelo or something. Taking away material until there is left what you want, which means stuff doesn't always get in. We can talk about that. And then the last thing is just a reminder, we're not just thinking about the sermon that was preached and the omelet you made, but the text. So we want to think about that whole big picture. It's not just a, well, I liked your sermon, or I didn't like your, it's not really so much about the sermon in that regard as it is the content, the omelet you made with this biblical text and whatever words I brought to it. So just to kind of reiterate on this expiration date idea, you'll find this hard to believe, but probably the most common day that I have done workshops with pastors is on a Monday, because the clock's not yet ticking desperately towards Sunday, and so Mondays are the day that pastors do workshops. And you'd be shocked at how many times I would say, so anybody, tell me about the sermon you preached yesterday. And they scratch their head. They're like, oh, shoot, what did I preach on yesterday? And they're the preacher. If they can't remember. Or in the seminary, I would say to my classes, Tuesday morning class, so tell me about your sermon you preached on Sunday. Oh, wow, what did I, did I do the parable? They can't remember their own. So if the pastor can't, then you kind of wonder, well, how long does a sermon live for the people in the pews? And by the way, for me, the longer it lives, the more rewarding it is. For me to hear something that was evoked, an omelet that was made weeks after a sermon, that really speaks to me. You know, like someone who says, I don't know if you remember this sermon you preached. It was about 6 months ago, but as a result, I started taking piano lessons. My gosh, I could just die right then. I mean, that's like the ultimate to me. I got emails on this sermon, trying to tell wheat from weeds, quite a few weeks afterwards. And I think I know why, because of the nature of a parable that's so open-ended. And I had some pretty controversial little pieces in there, too. So, the editing floor. When I wrote the book, The Fully Alive Preacher, I outlined the crazy process of putting a sermon together, which I jokingly say is about 4 million things you have to do. And I boiled it down to these 4 stages. So you study the scriptures, in this case a parable, and you figure out what's the one thing you want to say. That's the focus. And then you brainstorm stories and connections from our day. And then you take all that material and you try to create some sequence of that material. And then you get up and you give it. Usually on a Sunday, although we've been pre-recording ours. But there's actually something in between that second and third, and that is the editorial process. And that's where, in light of what you decided the one thing this sermon is about, some stuff doesn't get in. And that is so painful. Painful. I used to tell my students that stories will sit on the edge of your desk with puppy eyes looking at you like, please put me in the sermon. And it's very, very tempting because Sunday's coming and we want material. But that's a crucial process. So here's the text and the sermon. It was Matthew 13, back in July 19th. read verses 24 to 30 and preached a sermon called Trying to Tell Wheat from Weeds. So hopefully we'll see if you have any questions. I have a few just to kind of get you going. What are your reflections on the text and sermon from that day? You may remember that there was a homework assignment in there to study the parable and to watch a movie, Places in the Heart. And then another question, if sermon/texts are gospel, which is Old English for good news, what was the good news you heard? And the backside of that question is, well, what was the bad news for which the good news was spoken? So let's see if anybody's got a question or a thought. And we can be patient here. As they say on the telethons, all lines are busy, but don't give up. Keep trying.
Got one question, Mike, coming in from Teresa Williams.
Okay.
Can you explain the bad news question a little more?
Yeah, it's kind of, so let me back up just a little bit. When I said gospel is Old English for good news, the Greek word that's used to describe preaching is and heralding of the good news is euangelion, which literally means good news. And the King James translated it back in the 17th century as gospel, which was an Old English word for God's spell. So the idea was that God was casting a good spell upon us with this good news. But what theologians have started thinking is, well, if gospel's good news, it must be going forth as a kind of corrective for the bad news. So, for instance, I think in this case, when you have a parable about the kingdom of heaven, it must be a kind of contrast. I don't know if must be is the right word, but I think of it as a kind of contrast between, well, what other kind of kingdom were they familiar with? And that would be the Empire of Rome. So if this is good news from the Christ, what was the bad news for which this was antidote, might be a way of phrasing it.
One other question is, what about the burning of the weeds?
Yeah, you noticed that, did you? Well, we're going to look at the text as well as the verses that I didn't read on that Sunday. You may remember that the homework assignment was to watch that movie, but to wrestle with the parable, and I said, including verses that we didn't read. And we're going to look at both sets. Now, I am going to come back to that. We're going to wrestle with it, but yeah, that's... Well, it's problematic, but here I'll just at least preview this much. One of the key questions with parables, apart from the particular question you're asking about what in this particular case about the burning of weeds, the larger question that it raises is every detail in a parable meant to mean something, intended to mean something? And in the history of parables, the earliest church fathers, and they were men, they tended to allegorize, and they took every little detail and made it into something. And then a couple thousand years later, basically 1900, German scholar Adolf Ulicker said, no. Parables about one thing. You find the one thing. You don't pay attention to all these little details. It says, let's see, everybody was asleep. This person came and planted, right? What does that mean? They weren't on alert. They weren't paying attention. Well, others would say, no, you don't do that. What's the one thing? After Ulicker, which is where we are now, most scholars would say, well, it's probably not that every little detail means something, but neither is it just one thing. Parables are more like a work of art. So the question is, do you literally say, well, that represents some kind of judgment? Or do you say, well, that's what people do with crops? Doesn't mean necessarily that's what God does with people. But we're going to look at the verses where the so-called solution that comes a little bit later does intimate that. And then that raises an even harder question, which we'll get to in just a second as well.
That's all the questions we have for now.
Okay, all right. So here's the text.
Actually, there's one more that just came in if you want to take it.
Sure, what is it?
Did the fact that the enemy came while the master were sleeping imply that we need to be vigilant about enemies?
Say it again.
Did the fact that the enemy came while the master was sleeping imply that we need to be vigilant about enemies?
That is one interpretation. And it goes back to what I was just saying about, do you pay attention to every little detail, or is it more about the big picture? But there are people who hold to that in a more, not necessarily allegorical sense, but the idea would be, okay, well then maybe this is warning vigilance, because you do have some parables in Matthew that do speak about having vigilance, staying awake, the bridesmaids at the wedding and so forth. Okay, so we're going to come back to some of these. The reading starts at verse 24. And notice it starts with a he. He put before them another parable, which is interesting because that means we probably should have been reading before that, because it assumes we know who's talking. In this case, it's Jesus. Put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So there's so many things I could say, but one thing I'll just say right up front. If you want to make something out of burning the weeds, then are you going to also make something about how the enemy has planted this and then gone away? Are you going to make something of every little detail? So it's a good question, is what do we do with this? So here's the part I didn't read on that Sunday, and I'll tell you why here in a minute. So notice that we're at verse 36, so we're skipping some material in between. There's a few more parables, and then there's this little treatment about why does Jesus speak in parables, and then he leaves the crowds, went into the house. Some people, by the way, believe that when you have a house story in the Gospels, that's meant to signal that in the church we are given insights, the church would meet in houses, that the crowds didn't have. So his disciples approached him saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. So I'm going to switch slides on you because it raises several questions. First one, stage one, remember, is studying and focusing. Well, the first question is, how big is this text? Are the first verses the definitive text and the second not? Is the explanation, in other words, that second set of verses, is that from Jesus or is that from Matthew? Now, some people would say, what difference does it make? Still in the Bible. Others would say, makes a world of difference. Do you want to live by the teachings of Matthew or the teachings of Jesus? Others would say, well, you can't get to the teachings of Jesus because all you have is what Matthew gave you. But then there are scholars who've spent their whole lives trying to figure out what's authentic Jesus versus what's been redacted or edited by Matthew. I can say this, that there are a significant number of scholars who think that with these allegorical interpretations, where this represents this and this represents this, that's more Matthew's fingerprints than Jesus. And the reason they say that is because the nature of the parables that Jesus taught and the notion of a big picture as opposed to every little detail counting for something. And then there's some who say it's more consistent with his theology. In other words, some people believe Matthew is less lenient than Jesus. Matthew likes to throw people into fires more so than Jesus. And the second question is kind of related. Is every detail of a parable to be invested with meaning? So some people say, well, that's really not consistent with how parables work, and so therefore they think this is more Matthew's heavy hand. It's hard to know. And then that stage 3, creating and editing a sequence, we're also confronted with the parameters of a sermon. So one of the questions I had for me, wasn't, if I was writing an article for scholars, I would treat both and I would debate that stuff. But I was preaching a sermon. It's like 14 minutes and you can only do so much. And I used to tell my students the difference between a sermon and a study is folding chairs and donuts. If you're going to do a study, you got folding chairs, you sit in a circle, you got donuts and everybody, and you got an hour before the next thing. It's called Sunday school or Monday night, and let's just wrestle with everything. But you can't do that when you're putting together this omelet. You're breaking eggs that people are going to make an omelet out of. And so I have to, and every preacher has to wrestle with what gets included and what gets left out. I liked mentioning it because if people really were going to wrestle with this text, they needed to know that a few verses later there was an interpretation, not necessarily the interpretation. So just to give you an idea, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg, it's just a few tidbits that I had scribbled down that could have gotten into the sermon. I think anytime there are garden references, you just immediately have to think, does the writer have in mind the Genesis story? In this case, it would be after they've eaten that forbidden fruit because things have gone wrong, right? You're no longer in paradise. If it was paradise when there was just wheat, but now we have weeds, and so maybe is there some reference there? I also thought about Graham Greene's novel, The Power and the Glory, and his main character, the whiskey priest, because you may remember one of the things that I brought out in the sermon is that novels and movies are really good at presenting the complexity of the human condition. And I mean, this little phrase, whiskey priest. You put those two words together, and he's not just fond of whiskey, he's got a drinking problem. He's a drunk. And some of you may have read that novel. St. Augustine, probably the most influential theologian in the history of the church, late 4th century, early 5th, he had encounters with all kinds of groups. And one group was the Donatists. And the Donatists basically said that unless the clergy were pure, the gospel would be tainted. And so, in other words, sermons only worked if the person delivering them was totally pure. And St. Augustine won this debate, most people conclude, when he said no, that the efficacy of a sermon is not dependent upon the person who gives it. And so you can see how that would have been a controversy where they would use this text, because you can't tell wheat from weeds. And so some people have used that down through the years. Of course, the child sexual abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church, I mean, there's a classic example of weeds. And then I thought this was interesting. I didn't use it, but The Revised Common Lectionary, which is a list of readings that some churches follow regularly. We don't tend to do that here, but if you were following it, this passage would be the passage on the Sunday after Pentecost, which I find interesting because that story ends with 3,000 souls were added to the church that day. So what kind of people were they? 3,000. I'll bet they were all wheat, don't you think? Maybe not. Maybe there's some weeds among those folks. In fact, 2 chapters after the Pentecost story, or 3 chapters later, Ananias and Sapphira, they die in church because they were lying about their offering. So, I mean, you instantly get a picture of a church that's made up of wheat and weeds. So it's a kind of interesting juxtaposition there. By the way, when I'm putting a sermon together, I probably write down 25 pages of notes, something like that. And when I get through thinking that all the material is there that I might need, I kind of organize it in 2 columns. And on the one side is the textual theological stuff that might get in the sermon, and on the other side is the contemporary stuff from our day. And I just kind of try and figure out how to piece that together. But inevitably, preachers could preach 2 or 3 sermons out of the material that they've put together. So, I don't know what questions might be coming in, but I've got some to get us going. I mentioned this in the sermon that was preached, that the context is that chapter, chapter 13 of Matthew, starts with the parable of the sower. And here's another sower parable. And it's interesting because the way chapter 13 begins, and I'll read it to you, that same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. And then when he gets to that parable, listen to what he says. A sower went out. I think the way Matthew's put that chapter together, we're supposed to hear that the sower parable is Jesus. Jesus went out and he told a parable that starts with the sower went out. But now this parable starts with somebody else has sowed. And of course we find out what kind of sowing this person's up to. The genre may be one of the most important things here, really, that parables are riddles. And I mentioned this in the sermon. I've mentioned this many times in Bible studies, that you have to always keep in mind these 2 things. There will be stuff that's ordinary from the first century Mediterranean world. Yeah, people planted wheat. They harvested. They burned up the chaff. And I mean, these are normal things. But there's got to be something bizarre to the first century, not to you, because a lot of it's bizarre to us, but something that everybody listening then would have said, what? What? An interesting question, too, this Old Testament background. A lot of people, scholars, think that when you read parables, that Jesus is doing riddles on Old Testament texts. And he could be on the garden, but listen to this from Malachi. See, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all evildoers will be stubble. The day that comes shall burn them up, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings, shall go out leaping like calves from the stall. So you clearly hear a kind of good and evil and a burning and a reward, not a one for one, but some people have speculated, is this in the background, the notion of the wicked burned? That's a perennial human longing, dark side of all of us, that we want to see the wicked punished. And then the terminology. I mentioned one of these earlier, that the kingdom, when Teresa asked about that good news, bad news, the kingdom or the reign, a lot of scholars prefer the reign. Notice in Matthew it says the kingdom of heaven, and because he's a Jewish writer, he's avoiding the use of the name God there. He doesn't mean anything to do with heaven. He's not talking about heaven. He's not talking about heaven now. He's not talking about heaven after we die. It's a substitute for God. So the reign of God is like this. And then he tells this parable. I think, And many scholars believe that what he's doing is contrasting that with the reign of Rome under the emperor that they know full well. And he wants to make a contrast between the ways of Caesar and the ways of God. And by the way, the ways of Caesar would be to punish the wicked. The question is that the way of God? So I have some questions here, and maybe we've got some others coming in. Who is this enemy sower? What seems bizarre in the parable? What is this reign of God like compared to Roman rule? I mean, how would you characterize it? And then a question that's going to lead to more questions, some of which we're still going to get to. What theological issues are raised? And one of them we've already was mentioned is this burning up the weeds. So let's see if we've got any questions coming in. And for those of you who couldn't figure out how to log into Google, if you have a Gmail account, that would be the first step.
Clark says, this is so relevant to our times today with race relations. We've got a question from Nancy. So if the master is willing to wait on the weeds until harvest, should we wait when we encounter evil? Actually, I think that question is from Greg. But
yeah, that's a really good question. Now, I'll get to this in a minute, but there's two interpretations of this parable. One is that the judgment is now, and the other is that the judgment is at the end. So if you interpret it as this is a parable about now and church discipline within the body, then you would say, well, maybe we shouldn't wait. And this is what's been debated for years about this parable. And then the people who say, well, that's at the end, well, then that would fit. So, yeah, it's a really good question because theology is always going to say you can't base anything on one text. Theology is when you back up and you don't say, well, this parable teaches that we should, there's a verse that teaches you should cut your eye out if it offends you too. So you have to take, theology is backing up and looking at the big picture. So yes, you would put this into the hopper of what do we do about evil in the world, but you'd have to look at all kinds of passages to formulate a theology of what should be our response to evil in the world. And I'll show you here in just a minute that debate. I mean, I can put it up there, and other people are going to keep asking questions, but let's see. I think I put it there at the very end, Greg. Is this about the present age or the final judgment? Is it about the church or the world? In the interpretation that we're given verses later, it says the world. But throughout history, a lot of people interpreted this as a parable about church discipline, that within the church we have weeds, so what are we supposed to do about that? Because Matthew, you can see there on the second line, in Matthew 18, and it's really good if you can build a case within Matthew, since this parable is within Matthew, he talks about church discipline. If somebody sins, you're supposed to go to him, but the point was to go to him not to call him a weed and burn him, but to restore him. You were supposed to try and win your sister or your brother back. So one of the questions then is, well, okay, do I base it on present age or final judgment? Do I base it on the first part of the parable or the key that's given later? Is this about the church? Is this about the world? You'll notice I'm asking a lot of questions. I don't have definitive answers. It's a parable.
Yeah, so we have some more comments and questions. Jacqueline says, it seems bizarre to allow weeds to stay in the field, which would inhibit the development of the wheat. And then
right.
Nancy or Greg asked, but if you wait, do you risk choking out the good? So
yeah. Well, and see, that's a good example too of allegory. We're asking an agricultural question, not saying they didn't know that about agriculture, they did, but we're asking an agricultural question which says we're going to make something out of every detail in the text. I think theologically the big picture would be God seems to be more patient than we are. You know, I used the example from David May in the sermon about if someone paints a swastika on your garage and you say, oh yeah, don't worry about it, we're going to fix that in a couple years when we repaint the house. People want immediate action. They want to call a weed a weed. And Matthew may even be in that boat himself, whereas my own theology is God's a whole lot more patient than we are.
Yeah, Teresa comments kind of along those lines. I think what this parable suggests is that we are not able to determine always what is weed versus fruit. And in my own life, I see both weeds and wheat.
Yeah, and that really was the take that I did. I mean, I asked a lot of tongue-in-cheek questions, and I asked a lot of open-ended questions. I mean, the most poignant moments probably in the sermon, and they generated emails along this line, was when I talked about the rally in Charlottesville, and when I talked about a rally of Black Lives Matter or the protests or a Trump rally, and said, how do you tell wheat from weeds? You know, and I said, if you stay past curfew, does that make a wheat into a weed automatically? If you put on a blue uniform, does that make you weed or a wheat? Are there no weeds in uniform? Are there no, weeds among? So I was trying to point that very thing out, the complexity of the human condition. I do think that probably the most complicating factor, though, and I mentioned it, was the difference, and I've got it here on that slide, the complexity of a system. There's no question the Roman army as a whole, as a system, was evil. No question. But in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says of a Roman soldier he meets, I've never found faith like this guy has. And he even says in the Gospel of Matthew to love your enemies and pray for them. So if the army as a system is evil, it doesn't mean everybody in it is. And same thing, in my opinion, for a police force. A force of its nature doesn't have to be evil. Police force isn't an evil thing. I think as a general rule, a police force is a good thing, but it doesn't mean there can't be bad within it. So it's kind of the opposite effect here. But it's the difference between a system and individuals, and of course systems are made up of individuals. So I was trying to wrestle with the complexity of the situation.
Yeah, both Cindy and Greg, I think, are kind of saying similar things here, that maybe we need to be concerned with the overall point of a parable rather than worrying about every detail. Shouldn't we take the main theme and apply it to us in our own lives today?
Yeah, and the interesting question there would be, what is that main point that we would take to our lives today? Would it be God's generous grace toward us and therefore what we should extend to others? I mean, what omelet might people be making from it or having made from it? See, it's interesting that in Matthew 18, if someone sins, and that's within the church, within the body, and Matthew, by the way, is the only gospel that uses the word church, which just tells you something about, having written so many years later, 50 plus years after Jesus. He says if someone within the church has sinned, you go to them and you try to win them over, and if they don't listen to you, you take somebody with you. And if they still don't listen, well then, and so the idea was that you could win them back. So I think going back to Greg's question, in the bigger scheme of Matthew, there is this kind of notion of calling things out. But in the parable, there is this notion of, are you sure you know who to call out and what to call out? And have you looked at yourself? Because, it's in Matthew as well, is you got a log in your eye and you're trying to get this little splinter out of your neighbors. They've got a speck in the corner of their eye. It's been bugging them all day. No big deal. Just get a piece of Kleenex. But you've got a log sticking out of yours, and you're trying to get this little speck. So I think Matthew's kind of sending not mixed signals, but saying, well, okay, if we're going to if we're going to address evil in the world, within the church, how good are we at telling what's good and what's bad? That's why I said, movies, like the movie Places in the Heart, it's just such a brilliant exposition of that nobody, it's not the old Western with the white hat and the black hat. Everybody's got these mixed motives. So tell me if any more come in. I want to say just something about this. I thought it was interesting that I got emails from people that I would say characterize different perspectives, polar opposite perspectives. One saying, challenging the idea that that there's such a thing as, well, one came from the left and one came from the right, and both were upset. How's that? Which probably says the parable did its job. It made people wrestle. And of course, they asked these questions of me. What do you mean by this? Are you saying this? And one person even said, well, do you think this thing, this person is wheat or weed? What about this force, this we know? And I said, oh, that's easy on all three of these. The examples you gave me, all three. The answer is yes. Because I think that's the nature of humanity. We're a mixture of wheat and weeds. It's funny how, I remember one of the notes I had written down that didn't make it in the sermon was, I thought, it's funny how reading a parable like this, the reader assumes she or he, himself, herself, is a wheat, reading a parable about weeds. That's just where we come at it. The preacher breaks the egg, and the first omelet we start making is, well, I'm a good person, so let me see what I'm going to learn here about others, as opposed to maybe what I'll learn about myself. And there have been some questions come even after that, but my favorite, I just have to tell you this, this was one of those great moments. So in the sermon, I almost didn't put this in. I put in two little vignettes, kind of near the end. One was about walking with my granddaughter Emma and seeing she's going to pick a dandelion to take home, and I said, no, that's a weed. And she says, no, Papa, that's a flower. And I did tell that, but I first told a story about David Merrick, who was a disciples pastor here in Olathe, and who at his funeral died very young. One of the things that we celebrated was his love for wildflowers. He would look out on a field of wildflowers and say just how beautiful they were, and most people would say, oh, they're weeds. I almost didn't tell that. You have to make decisions as the editor of the sermon, what's going to get in, what's not. Emma's story would be fine by itself. But I left it in, and it turns out maybe it was providential. Here's the email I got a few days later. Hi, Mike. I'm Karen Merrick, pastor at First Christian Peoria, Illinois, and David Merrick's sister. I just happened to be on vacation today and therefore not live streaming myself from our own sanctuary and was looking for a place to worship live stream. My mother, a resident at Foxwood Springs in Raymore, has been with me since mid-March, so she wouldn't be experiencing quarantine alone. It was just truly a God incidence that we thought to check what country club was doing this morning. When you mentioned David's name and quoted him about weeds and wildflowers, we were in disbelief. You finished your thoughtful sermon, and Mom turned to me and said with tears in her eyes, we were meant to see this morning. Thanks for making our day. Blessings. I mean, preachers live for a moment like that. It's just one of those mysteries of God and the Spirit. And of course, I wrote her back saying how much that meant to me. And I put here, to keep the conversation going. I mean that because scholar in residence, the way I figure it, that's part of what I'm here for, is to just have a dialogue going and to wrestle together with the questions. And so to me, it's like, it's an open invitation always to have emails and phone calls and texts and, coffee on a patio somewhere and just wrestle with texts and sermons and theology. And, is it the nature of God to burn and to punish? And, Matthew seems to have that theology going, but that doesn't mean it has to be your theology. And as I've said before, one of the most, biggest shortcomings of Christian theological education in the church is thinking that the Bible's a flat document in which all the authors have the same views. But they don't. They have different theologies, and they sometimes contradict each other, just the way you and I have different theologies. So I love wrestling with the issues and thinking together about the different topics. So any last comments or questions that came in?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, there are probably some issues within that we kind of breezed through and some that we got stuck on. But that's the nature of it. And I just want to remind you that next week we're going to do Matthew 14, 22 to 33. So not that many verses later in the gospel. And the sermon was preached August 9th, so it's a little more recent. Of Boats and Bread was the title. And I don't know how many of you were able to go back and watch the sermon on wheat and weeds, but I think it's helpful if you can, because if you're like me, a lot of water under the bridge since then. I had to go back and watch it myself and reread the manuscript that I had written. All right, we'll see if anybody else has a question or a comment, and if not, we'll let you go.
There's just Dave's commenting that one of the takeaways for me, he says, is that the parable is the opportunity to use imagination to grasp something about God.
Yes, that's a really good insight. I think that's what parables do. I wish that more of us had grown up in a church where that was the case. A lot of us grew up and parables were read by preachers who then said there are three things that this parable teaches us about God, as if you could distill a riddle into 3 points. Or we heard a children's sermon in which people said, kids, parables are simple stories God told so that everybody could understand. But that's the exact opposite of what a parable is. And I think Dave's right. I think it invites us to use imagination and to play with imagery. Parables are fascinating because there are some parables that existed prior to the time of Jesus, but a very, very small smattering. Nothing like the parables that we have in the Gospels. And there are parables that exist in rabbinic literature 100 years after Jesus, and it really takes off after that. But nothing like in the Gospels. And so a lot of people say that the Gospel writers or Jesus kind of invented a genre, or at least popularized a genre that had not been that widespread. And the idea that this is what really fascinates me probably the most about parables. You know how people will say, I tell you what, when I get to heaven, first thing I'm going to ask God is, why in the world? And then blah, 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 whatever it is. So imagine that God's Son comes and says, you want me to tell you what it's like? Well, it's kind of like this guy who planted some wheat, and then the enemy came and sowed some weeds, and then the slaves said, well, should we burn up the... No, let's wait. That's what God's like. Huh? What? This is what we get, is riddles? I mean, can't we get a straight answer? Why do you always talk in riddles? Why do you think I talk in riddles? What is I think we are invited to use the imagination. I think we are invited to explore and to play and to wrestle with it instead of just simple, kind of packaged. Well, as they used to say on NPR's Car Talk, you've wasted another perfectly good hour. Hopefully, it's been a good experience for you. Hopefully, you had a good connection, it all worked, and you were able to chat. And those of you who weren't able to chat can hopefully figure that out. And next week, we'll wrestle with another story in the Gospel of Matthew, and we'll start again at 7 o'clock. And thanks again to Paul and to Matt and to all of you who joined us, and we'll see you next week.